Hi everybody, welcome back from lunch. We're proceeding with our third panel, Epistemocracies, Post-Truth and Cultural Power. Before I hand over to Mika, who will be moderating, just to remind you, you have these questionnaires, so do hand them back, fill them out, and enjoy the panel.
Thank you, Simon. I guess it is. Hello, everybody. This is the last panel. I hope you had a nice lunch and rest. We will continue today with the talk on post-truth. I will introduce my guests here. On my left side is Almantas Samalavičius. Did I pronounce it well? Yeah. Almantas is editor of the Journal of Architecture and Urbanism and associate editor of Kulturos Barai, cultural journal from Lithuania. He has a PhD in architectural history and theory, and he's a professor at the university, Vilnius University and Technical University in Vilnius. Next to him is Ighe. She's editor of the oldest Swedish journal. Am I right? Yeah. 125 years old. Ord&Bild, and is also a historian, and a lecturer in economic history and European studies. And on my right side is Jean-Claude, philosopher and senior researcher at the French National Center for Scientific Research and attached professor at the École Normale Supérieure in Paris. He's a specialist in political philosophy. Today with us is not one person. It is Nilgun Tutal-Cheviron. She was supposed to come here from Istanbul. She's a professor at the Faculty of Communication at Galatasaray University in Istanbul. She was not given the permission to come here. As you might know, public servants in Turkey need permission from their employer to leave the country. She filed for the permission and she never got it. She wasn't denied the permission, but she never got the permission, so she couldn't be with us. Simon will now read just extracts from her article, and we will consider that in our discussion as well. Please, Simon.
Yeah, so as Mika said, we were hoping to have Nilgun with us. She has contributed to our disinformation and democracy focal point, so she has an article published in Eurozine, and we'd also prepared a translation of her article which appeared in the September issue of Varlik. That unfortunately she hasn't been able to present herself, but I am able to read out parts of the translation. So I think this pertains very much to the question of cultural power when we're trying to define what that is. So she writes, in our times, the values of liberal democracy are in Turkey used by the AKP and Erdogan to justify the management of the country in an anti-democratic way. The language that Erdogan uses pronounces these values. The language that Erdogan uses to pronounce these values is like a simulation. But what is also important to emphasize is that the AKP is obliged to create a contradiction because it has not yet been able to silence all the media, although there remain very little, and that the new media always allow dissidents to find a way, despite the prohibition, to diffuse information that counteracts the anti-factual position of the AKP and Erdogan. Then she goes on to talk about cultural power and how that operates in Turkey. So the Islamification of Turkish society. Beliefs indicate an area which serves to filter and collate answers to prevalent questions and converts them altogether into information sets. In other words, beliefs cause limited answers to be given to questions with known answers, and are asked in a controlled and disciplined manner within societal boundaries. They are superficial and do not encourage thought. Belief opposes truth and is the sum of a society's common opinions, obsessions and phobias, rational and non-objective beliefs and ideas. In short, the ideological topology of a society. Within such a topology, those with low economic and cultural capital, because of the influence of popular Islam, are the section that are the easiest to rule through belief. Nevertheless, it should not be forgotten that these beliefs also have a restrictive dimension for societal groups with high economic and cultural capital. The societal actors who take on the job of defining and imposing categories of perception are battling to reproduce and spread beliefs in the sense described above. The difference in their positions in society corresponds to the diversity of positioning, which is the most prestigious part of the political struggle. The political struggle is a cognitive struggle over the power to impose a legitimate vision on the communal world. What actually legitimates this vision is the structure of the law, because the law makes a dominant vision that is legitimate and under guarantee of the state. It covers over relationships of dominance. As a form of meta-capital, the state is the supreme wielder of the symbolic capital and the symbolic violence to produce a dominant vision. It directs and oversees all the other types of capital from above. The rough distinction between white Turks and Kemalist bourgeoisie, who are closer to the Western secular modernist mode of symbolic production, and the new Turks of New Turkey, who are opposed to them, may be useful in distinguishing between these two groups. One important field in the struggle between societal groups is the making of ethical and aesthetic judgments. A group that obtains political power as the power that wields all the instruments of symbolic violence takes control of the state, and along with it the power to rule all other areas. It sets about reconstructing the cultural arena according to its own worldview. Turkey's new Islamist group is one that feeds on Islamist ideology in opposition to societal groups within a modern Kemalist ethics and aesthetics. We're going to publish the full translation. I do urge you to read it. Let's try to engage with Nilgun's position, even though she can't be with us today.
Thank you, Simon. We heard, I picked up some keywords from what you were reading, but I would like to frame the conversation not only about the cultural power, but about post-truth and how it plays in the contemporary political and social lives of the, mostly we are discussing Western countries, but when I say Western, I mean the whole Europe, but it plays out in our Middle East neighborhood quite openly, and we are not, we haven't touched upon it so far, but maybe in this discussion we will. So I would try to give some kind of framework before giving you the microphone and asking you to give your inputs. It's an article recently published by John Gray on The Guardian, and I find this definition or this take on the post-truth quite rich for as a starter for discussion. It says, talk of post-truth politics absolves liberals from responsibility for their defects and failures, while sustaining the comforting illusion that the supposed normality of the recent past can be retrieved if only we fight harder for their certainties. So with this quotation, or I would like to open the floor for Almantas and his intervention, and then continue with other speakers, and then after their interventions we will start the discussion. Almantas.
Thank you. You know, when I was preparing for this panel back in Vilnius, I read the articles written by my colleagues, and actually the article by Jean-Claude, you know, contains a certain criticism of the very term post-truth, because and I really, you know, I thought that I cannot discuss things before I explain my own relation to this concept or to this idea. And actually, I find that I cannot accept it for numerous reasons, not only from the theoretical point of view, but also from my life experiences, you know. I spent half of my life in the system that was called communism. You know, it collapsed in 1990. And then, you know, if you now call the situation post-truth, so it somewhat implies that I was living in a situation of truth or whatever, you know. Even if we take a closer look at the developments in international politics and whatever, I don't know where we find this epoch of truth. When somebody said that, you know, Iraq has to be attacked because they have a, you know, bomb down there, you know, or whatever. If you come back to earlier times when Mr. Molotov and Mr. Ribbentrop were redrawing, so to say, the map of Europe, you know, was that the moment of truth? So I strongly support the statement, though I haven't read the whole article by John Gray, you know, and I have some also reservations about him because I read some of his books. But anyway, I think that he noticed really that we deal with a problem. You know, now actually our discourses are flooded with post, you know, post-colonialism, post-modernism, post-work, post-job, and whatever, you know. And this shows that we really don't feel that we are living in the kind of epoch that has, so to say, its own kind of compasses, intellectual or whatever. So, said that, you know, I would also like to bring into this discussion, there was a marvelous book by a German philologist, Uwe Porksen. I read it in the English translation, and he speaks about plastic words. Actually, of course, he might reproach me because he uses a very strong criteria, about 30 kind of, to describe what he thinks plastic words. I use it as a metaphor. But I think that there are certain words that lost meaning. They don't lead us anywhere. Of course, when we refer, and that's why sometimes in my own writings I say so-called post-truth period or whatever, you know, we have a certain feeling that the whole world has changed. To a certain degree, it became more cynical. But also, you know, these concepts as if relieve us from our duties of everyday life, our civic duties, you know, because we have to act and react. And we often, you know, we end up with making statements about this and about that. And I had very personal, experiences a few years ago when I tried to get two medical doctors out of Syria. You know, and I worked with a number of important politicians, and nobody really could help, you know, to get these people out, you know. More recently, you know, have the problem, say, with Rohingya in Myanmar. I met a lot of people. I was dining with the British ambassador on Monday, and we were discussing this issue, you know. People somehow believe, oh, you know, there was this woman, you know, whom we gave, you know, a Nobel Peace Prize, you know, and now she's not doing anything, you know. So go to that country, you know. I live in a country that was totalitarian, you know, for 50 years. And now, after 27 years, we are still living in this situation, you know, when we have huge problems, you know. So look at, say, at Myanmar and what these people can really do. The military is still working. The civic leader is put into position. She's brought back from the realm of theory now to real life and real politics. And real life, in very many cases, does not go on well with concepts. If we take generally the politicians of the latest, say, 30 years, it was only Václav Havel, to my mind, who managed somehow to cope with theory and political realism. So maybe that's enough for the moment. I will contribute a bit later.
Okay, thank you, Almantas. And I don't know if you will continue with the Rohingya and Syria, but I am glad that Almantas touched those issues as well.
No, I don't have that much to say about Rohingya now, but as a specific crisis. But what I want to make out of these few minutes is, I think, to talk a bit about what was really on the top of our minds a couple of years ago, namely what Europe called the refugee crisis. And this is, of course, very closely connected to Syria. And I think that it's symptomatic that it hasn't been mentioned very many times today, that it's fine, I'm not like complaining, but a couple of years ago you couldn't have a political conversation at all in a European context without this surfacing. Now it's Brexit and Trump that becomes, you know, the signal of what's contemporary and problematic. Now, anyway, I've been thinking a bit about and looking a bit into how, let's say, Europe or some kind of European identity makes sense or doesn't make sense of the situation with refugees. And I think this has a lot to say to us all. In a sense, maybe we are fatigued by this concept of the refugee crisis. We don't, you know, but that's only, I think, acceptable if we see it as news. But if we see it as some kind of message to our culture and to our whole political existence, then it's still there and it's very much challenging a lot of the political conversations that we have. Obviously, a lot of what we call, and I think it's been so interesting to listening to a lot of these presentations. I don't know if propaganda or fake news or disinformation might be, I think there are elements of all this. Not so little about that has had to do with the refugees. What's the cost of them? What's really happening? Are they legitimate refugees and so on? And I think that has been, it points to, of course, what is very apparent in Jean-Claude's article, where you also refer to Hannah Arendt and so on. We cannot just like go look for the truth. Because the truth is always, we can have facts, of course, but we have to make judgments of those facts. It's not wrong to have an opinion. We cannot have a political world if we don't form opinions on that. But anyway, I think that, so therefore we have also seen, of course, that refugees has been used as a legitimization of an almost fascist development in countries who scarcely even receives any refugees. But it has also, in a country like Sweden, because I come from Sweden, it's a small country, it has taken a lot of refugees, we could say that. The government praises itself, but it's also a country that decided to close its borders, where the refugees has become an element of the political debate that is challenging basically everything we used to see. What I think also is important then, if we talk about cultural power, I mean, when I was thinking really much about this in 2015, I think we saw in the arts in Europe, it was a lot about the refugee crisis. It was about the actual experience of people that came as refugees or those who didn't even survive their seek for refuge. But it was also about all those people viewing, you know, the refugees. It was like all of us were, you know, we were watching a shipwreck and we didn't really know what to do. Should we turn our back? Should we send some boats? Or is this, you know, there was so much of that. And just to say, I started to think of this as how are we going to make history of this? What is going to be the history of this? And I say so-called crisis. It's apparently a European crisis, even though we could say that the crisis is, you know, it is Syria or it is Eritrea or whatever. That's in a sense the real crisis, but it did become a European crisis too. And I think that's interesting to think of as history in the making. How will we choose how to tell this story? And that's interesting, not the least from the perspective of, yes, we live in a time of very much of post. We're post so much, but what are we, so to speak, pre? What's our future here? So, well, maybe I should just try to. I think this is important for many reasons. I think it is important because, as we've heard, I think the name was Milena. I'm sorry, I don't remember the last name, but we can see how there is a European identity which is building basically on being, you know, bullied by the EU, being threatened by Islam and so on. And that is a growing narrative. I was very naively looking for a narrative where we would remember the solidarity that was shown to refugees all over Europe. You know, I thought that maybe we can build on this, you know, maybe this could be the heritage of our time. I feel that I was very wrong, but the reason I'm putting this in here is that because history, of course, needs to consist of true statements or true observations, but how does it have to be the truth with a big T? And there I think there is a critical, the postmodern challenge to that. What we have now, and I'm concluding here, is also a very strong right-wing narrative where you try to construct new, very exclusive identities and a new truth about the identity and heritage of Europe. Yeah, I'll stop there.
Thank you, Anne. Jean-Claude, so now you, what is, maybe because of the article that you wrote and that was published on Eurozine, maybe you can explain as well what is the difference between the political lie and post-truth. Because we have heard that politicians were lying, have been lying forever, but what is so unique about this phenomenon, if it is a phenomenon?
Yes, I think yes, we can take up the question of what is really new in the so-called post-truth politics or post-truth era, of course. And I think too that it's a questionable notion and that we may have serious doubts about it because it suggests that before we lived in a world which was absolutely respectful for facts, where the media were absolutely fair and without ideological bias and so on. So all this can be, of course, contested, and nevertheless, as my fellows said, it's maybe the new element where Brexit and Trump, that is to say, this kind of relationship, very loose, let's say, to facts and to truth, in the most famous and most achieved democracies of the world, let's say the US and Great Britain, and at the top level of these countries, and not in USSR or in totalitarian regime. In fact, we were used to think that lie with such a big scale was something usual in totalitarian regime, but not in democracies. That is to say that we were used to think that there was a link between democracy and maybe not truth, but a certain respect toward facts and data and a kind of truth. So here I think we have something about which we can discuss as being not so general as saying, well, before there was truth and now we have no truth. But now, in our contemporary democracies, the leader of the main, of the most powerful democracy has been judged as saying, I think, 70% of things that are false or inaccurate. So that's maybe a new element to be taken into account. And I wanted to tell a few words about a kind of interpretation and of imputation, so to say, about this historical situation. That is the idea that there is a link between postmodernism and post-truth, postmodernism and post-truth politics. And that's, at the beginning, it can seem very strange, because if we think, of course, in the US, for decades, when you say a relativistic view of truth and of science, some people hear postmodernism and French theory. Okay, French theory would be the kind of theory that have taught us, in a way, that there is no one truth, that science is a social construct, that science has no direct effect of liberation, but it can be also a tool of power, that maybe that there are no facts, but always interpretation, the famous quote by Nietzsche, cited by Foucault, and so on. So this kind of view are supposed to have given a background, a cultural background, to our era, in which we don't really think that there are things like facts, we don't really think that there is one truth, we don't really think that science can help us to live in a better place. So there is this idea of unwilling consequences of postmodernism and maybe French theory, even if we know that, of course, Derrida, Foucault, Lyotard, Bruno Latour are so far from Trump that it's really kind of strange thing to think this link, how, knowing the political fights of these people, it's really a strange imputation. Nevertheless, I think there too, there is something caricatural. There is something, even this idea, I think, of postmodernism, of French theory as a whole, is a kind of construction, and that we could show that Foucault, Derrida, Lyotard have not such a relativistic view of their own activity, that things are more complicated. And but it's true that, and I think it's interesting to see that, for instance, Bruno Latour, in recent texts and interviews, said, well, there is a new context. There is a new context for us. It's true that in the 80s, in the 90s, there was this kind of science war, but that meant that we should have a more realistic view of science. We should explain how it's linked sometimes with power, it's linked with kind of interests that are not purely theoretical, and so on. So we had to do this job to conquer a kind of realistic view, sociologically speaking, of how science is really made, and so on. But he says now, a few days ago, but he had already said that a few years ago, there is a new danger, that is to say, for instance, the United States, the President of the United States, cuts off funding for science. He claims that global warming doesn't exist. So here, we have to defend science. We have to defend this activity of research. And it doesn't mean that all we have said before was not accurate, but it means that there is now a priority, that is to defend our very conditions of construction and debate, and defend kind of stakes, so to say, a kind of topics in which the lives of maybe thousands of people could be concerned with this kind of things. So I think it's interesting to see that Latour doesn't say that this postmodern approach was wrong, but he says that now we have to shift our targets, so to say. We have to take into account this situation of attack against science, and that implies maybe a new priority for intellectuals. And I have a little the impression that there was a revival of the controversies of the 80s and 90s about postmodernism there with Trump in France or in the US, saying, who is to blame? The French theory, pragmatism, or other philosophical trends. And I think it's not very, very fair or interesting. What is more important, I think, is to see that people like Latour and others see the necessity of maybe new alliance and new unity of intellectuals and scholars to defend, let's say, a common ground for democracy and for science, and maybe to build a new, it was a word coined by Pierre Bourdieu, who is sometimes also invoked in this tradition, new collective intellectual. It is to say that maybe intellectuals and journals should unite to define the minimal conditions of a good functioning of a democratic institution in which science must have its place, as well as a minimal respect for factual truth, even if it's a notion that had been challenged, but I think we can't avoid to refer to a kind of factual truth. So that was the first point I wanted to grasp, but the second one maybe I'll come back later and okay.
Well, can we? Anne mentioned that, and now you implied that. Can we then distinguish between post-truth with a capital T and post-truth with a small t, and what would be the difference? Who wants to take on? At this point, I would like all of you to, if you have a question, to raise your hand. We don't have to stop the discussion. You can just, yeah, okay. We already have one comment or question, but does anybody want to?
I would like to say that, you know, it's not perhaps that relevant, you know, how we call it with big T or a small t. You know, the very notion itself. Of course, it exists, and you know, in many ways, I would like to go back to your comments. You know, I think that politicians, you know, sensed the potential of certain theoretical or philosophical vocabulary of postmodernism and relativism far better than the philosophers themselves, you know, who were speaking about the end of grand narratives and whatever, you know. When it entered the realm of politics, wow, that was, you know, a new founding. We don't need... there is no truth, you know, we can do whatever we like. We can construct any reality and present it in any way that suits our present interests. To that matter, I would like to recall a book. I think in 1960, Lewis Mumford published a book on city history. And he mentioned, you know, actually he discusses the history of the city in the world, but no, sorry, that was from another book, from The Culture of Cities, where he describes the state of necropolis. He says, this is the state where the words lose precise meaning, when there are only symbols, but the symbols do not communicate anything at all. Today, when you look at the politics, you know, I find really big difficulties in understanding what is the difference between parties on the left and parties on the right. Because when you look at their programs and what they are doing in real life, you know, there is no big difference between the conservatives and the liberal left. you know, it's simply tags or simply names. Say, in my own country, I was involved in debates on higher education and to a certain degree in politics. The most funny thing that neoliberal policies is adopted by social democrats, by conservatives, and by liberals, you know. The only answer they have comes in the form of neoliberalism, you know. And then the question is, so what can we say about the identities? Because these identities, they are only remain as tags. They don't have real meaning. We have moved to a situation when the words don't tell any longer, they do not communicate truths about these, so to say, political parties and their doings and their programs.
Well, that's why I refer to the big and small t. It's because one is concerned with facts and the other is concerned with the consensus on the narrative. And but there was Milena had a question or a comment.
This is how I see it after having listened to the panel. The theme of truth, or respectively post-truth, has something to do with the plead who has a special relation to truth and on what grounds. Seen in this way, postmodernism is a special regime of democratization of the access to the right to have this special relation to truth. It democratized it. Well, the democratization of truth is predecessor of the regime of post-truth. I agree. Posts are those posts, these posts that are, they say nothing. As the term postmodernism says nothing, actually. Well then, this democratization of the regime of access to the special relation to truth introduced activism as a voice, pretending, claiming on good grounds to have this special relation. And it's a process of democratization. I want very much to insist on this. Activists have much to do with the formulating of apocalyptic thinking, if we get back to Greenpeace and this kind of activism. So I can see it as a process evolving, as a process of democratization that Jean-Claude suggests to push further through a battle, which in the long run was a postmodern idea. We have to struggle to be collective intellectual. Otherwise, in this neoliberal regime can be seen as the radical democratization of the plea to have a special relation to truth. And medical doctors are complaining that patients are arguing their authority.
On that note, did you want to? I just wanted to add to this and ask, can we think of democracy as primary as conflict and not consensus? And does it help thinking about it in that respect, in that way? Is it is there a constructive perspective on democracy?
Well, I would just like to start to respond a bit to your first question. And I was thinking then, I know that I'm veering a bit from what might be truth to actually gathered facts, which are, made on our societies. And I was reflecting because, and this has to do with postmodernism, which is in a sense the post-truth with a big T, I guess, on a theoretical level. But I also think about how states have gathered information about their inhabitants and societies, our economies, the way we live, and all that, in the modern era, post-war, but still modern era. I'd say that was done and also connected to an agenda of change. Some of that I would strongly oppose and all that, but there was an idea of using these facts in order to well, push society in one direction or the other, and that was coupled with actual redistribution of money and resources. Now we have a lot of data collected also by our states, and we can see that also the European Union produces very much of statistics and so on, but there's not much of programs there for actual change. There's a lot of knowledge, but not so much of actual change. But that was my reflection on what you said first about the post-T.
Yeah, maybe I can answer here. I think too that there was a dimension of democratization in what we call maybe not the right way, but postmodernism. That was a way to challenge the authority of science with a big S, maybe of the intellectuals themselves, of the idea that there was the true and the false, there was ideology and a real science of history, for instance. What is complicated, of course, is that postmodernism was built by former Marxists, often like Lyotard. So it was a way to renounce to a certain absolutist view of truth, like in Marxism, Leninism, and to say that we must be more open to the variety of language games, and to recognize the value of the dissensus, of the différent, and so on. So there was a kind of democratization, including, if we see Foucault, for instance, with the idea that there are some dubious sciences. There are sciences like psychiatry, psychology, criminology, which are very entangled with power, and that we have to question the effects of power of these sciences, and to give more to pay more attention to people who are the objects of this science. So there was also an effect of democratization, and to say we have to hear people who are in asylums, who are in hospitals, and they can contest the authority of their doctors, of their judges. So, of course, there was this dimension, and there was the idea that we had to put forward to go beyond the traditional tools of social criticism. We had to develop new tools to take into account the very effects of domination, of the very tools of emancipations, of what had been seen that as tool of emancipation as science, and so on. So there were effects of democratization. The question now is the possibility of a cynical use of this more relativistic view of things. It's something to say, well, we have to, I think, democracy has to have a dose of relativism, and it was John Dewey or Hans Kelsen who said, well, in a way, democracy is a regime in which a certain relativity of perspective and truth is a good thing. But the question is now that the rulers themselves, the government or the industrial interests, use this idea that there is no fact, there is no truth, to say, for instance, well, if there are ecological problems that trouble these interests, that in their exploitation of some places or resource, we say there are no ecological problems. There is no global warming. So we say, okay, we can't get rid of all this work, scientific work, data about ecology, about global warming, to say, well, you know, everything is relative, and so we cannot bother with that. And here it's, of course, I think, a perversion of this very process of democratization that could have been observed towards the authority of science.
But Rachel, just I saw you. I would like to go back to. Oh, that's to go back
Mic
to the...
drop.
To what Vladan was yesterday quoting, he quoted Kastel's battle over the minds of people. Today we heard a lot about, or mentioned quite a few times, the emotionality and irrationality as opposed to rationality. We heard something, people want to be heard. So all these words that we heard, to me, there's nothing irrational around it. And this is my opinion, but there is nothing irrational about it. It's very rational. It's not maybe connected and coordinated from the, invisible hand, by the invisible hand, but it's very rational, and it has to do a lot with economic power that we haven't really talked about today at all. And then I'm going back to the economic power and the way it is wielded, and the strategies and tactics. In order to understand this phenomenon, can we go back to that? Can we say, and there was with Milena's presentation actually, that was implied, and that is that there are very specific, very concrete interests behind this, which are not the battle over the minds. It's battle over very concrete resources. So can we go back to the class struggle and look from that perspective? What we are experiencing now in Europe is that we have very disenchanted people who are not heard and who used to be catered for by the left politics for a long time. And now they are snatched by the alt-right, together with all these post-truth type of strategies. I would call them strategies and tactics, and not necessarily phenomenon. So can we talk about that?
Can I talk about that? Yeah. So, because it ties in with the point that I was going to make. I'm Rachel Jolly. I'm the editor of Index on Censorship magazine. That my point was going to be that actually there's nothing new here. That this is storytelling. This is basic storytelling, and that's always happened. And it's convenient for national powers or the people who want to be leaders of countries or aspire to have different types of power to create stories that have impact. So if we look at the 19th century establishment of the myth of exceptionalism in the US, it was not the real story of the US. It was part of a story which they chose, which was that, the mythology of that anyone could rise to the top, that by coming to the US they had all these opportunities open up to them. It didn't acknowledge that there were many people who were indentured servants, that there was a class struggle, that the people at the bottom very rarely got to the top, and all those things in between. So actually, I think what we're talking about is a battle of ideas that's always happened. And a lot of these stories were based on giving a particularly hopeful vision of perhaps the next period. And maybe one of the changes is that the stories, particularly now, are much more identified with fear than hope. But I think that the idea that there was previously truth and now there is no truth, or that somehow there's been a massive change, I think is wrong.
There is one more aspect I would like to bring into focus in this discussion, is that I believe everyone in this group believes in the power of democracy, and we stand on the same, so to say, we take the same stand. But what I think is very important to realize, especially in this climate of so-called post-truth, and coming back to what John Gray said, that even in the very liberal democratic Western tradition, we elaborated a certain language regime, then you cannot talk about certain things. You mentioned that, okay, that some people still remain silent. Yeah, that's a problem, you know, some from minorities, migrants, and so on and so on. But the most important thing, I think, is to rethink this whole practice of talking. When I stayed in America back in '99, you know, I came to a big Chicago university, you know, and I realized soon very well that a lot of things are unsaid, you know. For example, everybody was working, you know, each office of each professor, you know, had doors open. I asked, you know, why do you sit with doors open? Oh, you know, this is our, you know, we want to be very open. Nothing of the kind, bullshit. I learned later that everybody is afraid of to getting into sexual harassment stories, and that's why they keep their doors, you know. So, and you have lots of things like that, you know. You can't say this, you can't say that. In '95, I was speaking in Norway, you know, and suddenly a very nice progressive lady, you know, attacked me. How can you speak about Russians when you are speaking about Russian minority in Lithuania when you come from a Lithuanian majority, you see? So, if you come from majority, you cannot speak about minorities, you know. Only minorities are allowed to speak about their issues, you know. If we take immigration, it's a very complex, huge issue because with migrants come a lot of criminal problems, lots of things, you know, and the far right uses what the liberal, so to say, circles choose to silence. So I think generally there is a need to rethink the language itself, to bring about this ability to talk about very unpleasant things. I remember some 10 years ago, I stayed in a conference with Salman Rushdie, and he told his personal story. You know, he was invited by the British Customs. They found that a certain amount of video cassettes containing a film about him, a very ugly film, were smuggled into UK. And they said, do you want us to take them away? I said, I looked at this film, and it was really insulting on the personal level. But I said, no, let the people watch and let them decide where the truth is. So I believe if we chose such a perspective to talk things, what, by the way, Dalai Lama is speaking, we need to have a dialogue.
Yeah, but for the dialogue, we also need to have a platform where everybody is equal, and we don't still have that. So that's why I asked the question about the economic power and about who is on the stage. Obviously, four of us have microphones, and they have to fight for their one microphone. So, yeah, I mean, I understand. I agree with some points, but I think that we have to also talk about the conditions behind it. Who gets to talk?
No, I really believe that economic inequality is a very pressing issue that is also touching upon democracy and what we can say and how we can think. And I mean, we have this tension that, in a sense, economic inequality between countries have been going down, a very positive thing. There's been positive developments in many places of the world where people actually have the possibility to live longer and so on, lead somewhat healthier lives, all that, which is very, very good. But if our perspective is European, then we can also see that a lot of things is not pointing to more of equality. And that is very apparent after 2008. It has to do with how we have sort of enlarged what is seen as, I know EU and European is not the same, but there has been an enlargement there. And it was referred to with this, how people in Bulgaria, for example, I thought it was, but also some other of the Eastern European countries asked, you know, do you live on a Russian level, or do you live more on a, what's your self-estimation of this? And the thing is, where they see themselves as very less privileged. And this may, in a sense, be false, but it may also be true, because we've also had, there's a big difference between the upper levels in Europe in terms of incomes and how people live. And that actually plays out almost as Northwestern Europe is still rich. Southeastern Europe is still, you know, poorer, and so on. And I think that is deeply problematic both for national democracies and for every attempt to do democracy on an international level. It's not all problems, of course, but we should also, just to conclude, I'm not sure there's 1,000 things conclusions to draw from that, but we now live in a world which is almost totally capitalist. That has never happened before in history, and that's an interesting moment.
Yes, thank you. Of course, we see that this post-truth or this so-called post-truth is not the only problem of politics today, and in a way we have to situate it, to locate it in a wider context maybe, and to understand how it could have such a success, how the Brexit, for instance, could win. And for that, we are positively doomed to thematize the topic of economy and of a certain use in. So that's why in the paper published in Eurozine, I talked of democracy between post-truth and epistemocracy, because there is also the possibility of using, for instance, neoclassical economy, a certain type of science, which is not false, but which is, of course, a peculiar view of economy too, as a tool of domination. And in a way, we live for decades under this idea that neoliberalism or the programs of liberalization and austerity are the only rational way, that there is no alternative and so on. And this use of a kind of authority of economy and has anti-democratic effects also, and it can explain, I think, the resentment also against some elites, including European elites, and this kind of ideas that, in fact, we can't trust what is given as data, what is given as objective necessity, what is presented as really a framework for our reflection. So I think we have to challenge many things at the same time. That is this increasing use of maybe sometimes lies, sometimes fake news, sometimes it's not lie nor fake news. For instance, when Trump says, no one knows that better than me, no one knows business better than me, no one does care more for the rights of women than me, no one is more conservative than me. That's a real quote I give, because he say always, no one is X than me. So is it a lie? No, not really. It's kind of boasting. So it's this way of doing politics that is a little surprising at this level, I think. That's an element of maybe of novelty. But it's not exactly a problem of falsehood, because it's a problem of type of speech in which, indeed, it doesn't say, believe what I say, but trust me as a person who is very... I don't know why, very preposterous. So, it's, I think, so post-truth is only part of course, this context in which there is a distrust for maybe what has been a kind of grand narrative. So maybe it's a postmodern view of the last decades, but that was the idea of neoliberalism as the only rational way. So the neo-populist right-wing movements are also a reaction to that narrative, which was indeed, in a way, the narrative of the establishment. We can deny that, so we have also to deal with this problem.
There is a...
Yes, a short commentary to Jean-Claude. I think that...
Turn on the mic or just
yes.
bring it... Yeah.
I think that the problematics of truth should start with some elementary definition of what we understand under truth, and Jean-Claude as philosopher should propose as such a short definition. I should say that the democracy has never been based on the truth, if we understand under the truth absolute truth or monopoly over the truth. So there is a risky direction in this thinking that insists on re-establishing the truth as a foundation of democracy. Because we know that in the very genesis of modern democracies, the main enemy was the institute of absolute monarchy that insists exactly on monopoly over truth. And the Nazism and the communism was such an ideologies in 20th century too. So if we take as axiom some other definition, for example, of that of the already mentioned Dewey, John Dewey, that the truth is warranted belief, maybe we'll be more successful. Because the important thing is what is warranted. Warranted according to Dewey is a warranted belief is that belief that is a result of slow, difficult, heavy, interactive investigation. And if we understand under truth this difficult interactive investigation, we could apply this idea to the good journalist investigations and to the good academic investigations too. The main problem today is that, to my mind of course, is that the concept of truth loses its meaning not because of the relativism, but because of course, of the speed of the capital circulation and of the speed of the semiotic circulations. I mean that we have this losses of the idea of truth when we speak on some advertisements and on propaganda in the recent times. One lie repeated 100 times becomes a true. Is an imperative only for such kinds of endeavors like some brutal advertisements and some brutal, for example, the Russian propaganda at the moment. But what is our deficit? Our deficit is that we forget the critical legacy, including the legacy of the French school. They insist that the truth is not possession of the individual. The truth is not private or personal opinion. It is, of course, a result of long investigation. And our problem today is that we have lost the authority of the science and of the good journalism. Thank you.
Thank you. Do you have any more? Yeah. Okay. One, and then one.
I wanted to ask, also looking back at the previous panels and presentations, can we talk about post-truth without talking about the internet and technology and media? Because that hasn't been mentioned at all. And not just as something that has changed, because I agree, there was post-truth and lies in the past, but something has changed, I think. And it has to do with the internet. And the internet is not just the medium that is now delivering post-truth, but it's also structuring the content of post-truth, I would say. So why hasn't there been said anything about technology yet?
Can I just ask to collect one more question, and then maybe we can respond to all three?
Oh, thanks. Well, just to steer the debate a bit, a little more up, I think that discussing post-truth is a matter of, you have to be kind of privileged to discuss post-truth. And I think that now when we have, wars in the Middle East, immigration crisis, and climate change, this post-truth concept is a little less important, in my opinion, because you feel the real consequences. When you have immigrants in your country or at the border, or when tornado takes your house down, you feel the real consequences of that. So I don't think that this postmodern debate is that important in these situations.
Thank you, Luca.
I think you
we'll talk about it later.
Brought a very important issue of technology into this discussion, and I must say that, when we were sitting at lunch and discussing what we will do, we agreed that we won't talk about Russia. And actually, I wanted to talk about contemporary technologies, media, and Russian influence. So I won't go on in
we
this.
We had a whole panel on that.
Yeah, in this subject. But what I think is that what really happened during actually recent decades, that there was a very huge optimism about the new media. Oh, there is internet, oh, it's so good, people now will be able to participate, we will hear these voices that were not heard or silenced or whatever, What happened is actually happened absolutely different things. My friend, who is communications professor in US, recently wrote in his book that we think that people are in internet are looking for various kind of ways to express their opinions. They are looking for pornography. He uses various surveys. The other thing is who really controls and uses this media. There is also the issue of ownership. What is happening in contemporary world in this capitalist system? I am not a great fan at all of Zizek, but he has remarked very nicely. It's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. So ownership now is in the hands of large companies. The book industry is controlled by 4 or 5 large international companies. Media is also controlled. I remember at one of PEN congresses in Tokyo, we had a very interesting lecture by Vandana Shiva, and she brought so many interesting facts that nobody knew. For example, and I actually went through very many papers, nobody mentions that. In India alone, when they introduced this GMO to peasants, 200,000 people committed suicide because their farming collapsed, Nobody was very much interested in discussing this. Yeah, she told how much money is put in order to disinform people. Very reputable international magazines are being bought. Experts are being bought to tell what the companies need. So what this brings to issue, how can we make use of various internet technologies? What is fact there and what is fake? For example, very many people thought that, okay, anonymous comments you can find, they really represent, people's opinion. In Moscow alone, you have a bureau which employs about 300 people. They are paid by the government, and their only job is to spread various anonymous comments on certain subjects. So they are going all around the world and creating fake discussions, creating fake facts. How do we deal with that? I don't have an answer, but I see in this a very important problem, because it's not the people, it's not the so to say green grass movement that control this sphere. Internet is equally controlled by capital, by powers and international powers, But this issue is extremely important, because we cannot expect changes in say, democratic regime if we continue to base ourselves on certain wrong ideas that, we are progressing, that simply the fact that we have more technology gives us more opportunities to participate politically or whatever. I don't think there are more opportunities. They are more complex and more complicated today than they were 30 or 40 years ago when newspapers or TV was so to say, running the show.
Well, just a straight answer to why no mention of technology. I think it was, in a sense, out of respect that this had been, thoroughly discussed. Of course, you're totally right that it's ignoring a very important part. But I think it was because the two panels before were actually very good on that. But I mean, we also have the fact that expressions of political opinions, and they may be what we call well-founded or not. They are important, and they are on the internet. And yes, people look for pornography, but I mean, you can do that in the analog world too, and it has been happening. I think we should concentrate on what happens here with both with news and how people make political sense or nonsense of these. And I think what we've seen is that also political power has to react to, whether it is those people employed by Russian government or it's actually disenchanted citizens, people who are, angry of something that happened, any political scandal or a scandal they think is. We can see how politics also have to devote a lot of time to managing crisis, managing what happens on the party leader's Facebook page, etc. They're sort of easily captured, and that, of course, this speed that everything happens in is important here. And that sort of creates a situation where it's not about truth, it's only about credibility. These two could go together, but sometimes they just don't.
To answer Luca's question, I would invoke something that we heard yesterday at the survey presentation of the survey of the media, the second lecture, and it was mentioned legitimization and popularization. And I think that the discussion on post-truth in itself is not, I can agree with you that it's not so relevant when you take a look at the conflicts around the world. But I think in the consequence it's very relevant because ultimately what European societies are experiencing now are legitimization of, and you and I know that probably very well, coming from Croatia, is legitimization of discourse that was unimaginable only 10 years ago, and popularization of that discourse. So I'm taking these two trends that were mentioned yesterday, completely unrelated to this topic, but that is what post-truth discussion is about. And in the consequence, it can influence, it directly influences all these international conflicts that we are talking about. So now we have in Syria, the whole world is fighting. You don't know who is where, what fraction, you can't really, it's not post-truth, it's a complete mess of information. And I'm sure that the situation, no matter how complex or complicated, it still can be understood. But with this kind of funneling of all kinds of information and misinformation, it is difficult then to know how to bring these two doctors that you were talking about, how to bring them here. So I think it is, I mean, I'm not justifying the panel, but I just wanted to kind of clarify why this is not a postmodernist theoretical topic, as you implied.
Yes, I think an answer to that is to say that precisely if you consider global warming, climate change as an essential question, it's a problem to see how the public discourse, for instance, in the US, is related to this event. And if a president can say it doesn't exist, I think we have a direct link between this problem and post-truth. That is precisely this kind of problem that we are dealing with, I think. And of course, the technological aspect is very important because we can consider that democracy had a a link also with modern democracy, with a kind of a quality of inquiry. That is, Ighe was very interested for journalism, but also public establishment of data through public inquiries. And in fact, if we go back to the very beginnings of democracy in Greece, we see that it was a contemporary for new sciences and a new kind of law also, in which the historia, that is to say the inquiry, was considered as important to establish facts and so on. And of course now with internet we see that we have another kind of media which doesn't function this way, and in which indeed fast-checking or the care for verification of information is not so important. And I suggest that there is more fast sharing. You share what you like things, and of course you constitute a kind of community of what you think is true. There are this kind of differentiation in the public. There is no one public, as it has been said, no one public opinion, but a kind of constellations, many constellations, maybe which share some information between them, and that's a very, of course, important background also for this interrogation about the role of verification, of deontological relationship with information, with data, because with this media we see what is more important is indeed the multiplicity of the information, the mass of information, and the fact that we can circulate in it, and of course we can have our comment on it. We can have an immediate comment which is on the same level than the paper of very informed people. So we have this kind of trouble with maybe with proof, with verification, the impression that no hierarchy is given with information. And that's, I think, the technological background of this interrogation on post-truth era. In fact, the book by Ralph Kay was also about this element, that is to say, how technology, how internet changes our relationship to information.
Yeah, there is one. Oh, okay, this one was first, and then here.
Thanks. I'm not sure whether this is an observation or a question, and I think it's kind of been talked around already, but I just thought that what's being discussed there doesn't really seem to be any consideration for class. And it's sort of been mentioned in different places, but my sort of feeling is that historically public platforms have been dominated by the ruling class. And since kind of the inception of the internet and social media in particular, it's one of the first times on a kind of global level that working class voices, and I don't want to sort of generalize and say the working class in a macro way, but the many dimensions of working class voices are able to access and have that public platform. And that kind of raises the question of, in the post-truth era, who owns the truth? Because in the past it has always been the elitists, ruling class. And now so much, maybe it's not the ruling class anymore. So I'm just wondering how that kind of factors into what the panel and what the audience have already talked about.
If I can just say something brief, that I think that is very interesting, and I also think that I would like to know more. I just have to say, I'm sure there is data out there to at least answer this in a more also in a quantitative way. I think that, for example, Twitter is more dominated by media people and so on, and Facebook is more, in that sense, more open platform. And I'm sure there's like differences here in how people use it and how they have the possibility of expressing their opinions. But I think what you say is very relevant, and I think that some part of this that we think of as a very confusing discourse in many ways, where it's hard to understand what's really true and not, and what's facts, and how people use this is of course that people who didn't have that access to the public conversation now can do that. And that is a major challenge, and some of it is very good. It's very good that a lot of people can have their voices heard who wouldn't have done that before. Yeah, I'm just saying I would like to know more, and I'm sure there's data and research about there, which I don't know about.
I would like to ask something like, I try to imagine what will be the topic in 1 year. We started to think about these panels and the topics a few months ago. And I'm wondering if it's already, if we're not a step behind, which is not our mistake. Time is shifting very fast, but when I look at the title and I shifted a little bit, I changed a little bit, and I say with post-truth to cultural power. Isn't this what has already happened? I mean, in the very center of Europe, we had elections, 2 of them. And especially in Austria, we're facing a dramatic situation, also in regards of how will the conservative parties all over Europe react to that. And I don't know, and on the book fair, just 2 weeks ago, the far right, the alt-right, the Nazis, the neo-Nazis, and the right itself, they dominated discourse and the scenery violently. And aren't we, and I put this in a provocative words, aren't we, it seems to me that we are a bunch of liberals sitting in a room looking at the battlefield and the smoking rests of something that was granted for a long time. And maybe in a year we will look back and ask ourselves, how are we going to talk to the Nazis now? How are we going to react to those? How tolerant are we towards those that come to the book fair and smash things? And it's, I mean, before we said, in the panel before, it was the left and the right are using this propaganda. And I think there's a big difference between the left and the right. The right is anti-Semitic, racist, violent. They kill people. And not only discourse, how do we deal with that? And is this not already happening? I mean, what is happening in Austria in the next few weeks will have an influence on us here, and on the funds, and on the discourse, and the cultural power is maybe already in their hands. And I have so many questions about how to react to that hegemony that they got in the last few years, and that they get even more. Within weeks, things have changed a lot in Germany and Austria, and I have no answer yet, but I'm very curious and scared to see what will be the discourse in 1 year.
I agree with previous people. I started to think that this notion of post-truth that I didn't like at all when it arrived in the beginning of year or in the end of last year or some into my mind, in my information field. But then I started to think that it is actually very clearly expresses the era, and it has been said already that there is not any hegemonic truth, and also there is not. Maybe we could define ourselves that we are living in kind of trans-disciplinary, trans-theoretical, trans-ideological field, so that there is everything in one time, because in the global field we also see the countries which are going through the modernity or modernization phase of their development, then the others are going through. So everything is in the field at the moment, and that means that there is this post-truth. So in the meta level, in the theoretical level, in lively practices, in the reflections. So that is, it makes this era very interesting and not easy to handle. Maybe because it is very easy when there is a very clear ritual of truth or attitudes, clear attitudes. So it was just an idea. Thank you.
Thank you. I would really wish to live in boring times once in my life, but it doesn't happen. I would like your maybe final thoughts, because we are, 1 minute before. And I would actually like you all to respond to Daniel's question.
In fact, the word hegemony has been pronounced, and I think it's interesting because there was an old reflection, and we have talked about class and class struggle, and by a famous Marxist theorist, that is Gramsci, about hegemony as cultural hegemony, and the construction of cultural hegemony as a precondition for maybe political domination. And I think it's important because, for instance, in France, we had the impression in the last years, maybe the last decade, that there was a change, a shift in cultural hegemony, let's say from a liberal view to something very conservative and a kind of narrative of decadency, and almost far-right narrative in which France was in decadency because it has lost its identity because of the new populations. And of course that was not directly uttered in mass media, but that was a kind of music, so to say, and more and more present in the public field. And what was interesting was, in the last election in France, was that the question of hegemony was raised, and you had, in a way, two responses from left and liberal sides of the political field. There was first the idea that against this far-right populism, or very right-wing populism, you had to build, to construct a new hegemony, a new cultural hegemony, and maybe a new populism, a left populism. So that was an idea from, Ernesto Laclau, Chantal Mouffe, which came in the French political debate through the move Les Insoumis, La France Insoumise, and Jean-Luc Mélenchon. It was the idea, well, populism, socialism is not today a very enthusiastic word for many, many people, including in the left. So we have to find something else, maybe left populism. But of course it was much debated. And Macron on the other side, which was, well, let's say center, center, he says he's both right and left. Well, so what was interesting is that he had a kind of counter-narrative against the narrative of decline. Very explicitly, he built a counter-narrative, and he said, yes, Europe is good, Enlightenment, France is a very important nation because of the human rights, of the tradition, and so he kind of proud, progressive proud, even if we can, of course, challenge and discuss the content of his politics. But what was interesting is he was also constructing a kind of hegemony, a cultural hegemony, by assuming things that, including in the left, were, well, are we still European? Are we still pro-Euro? Are we still? Do we still believe in progress? Do we still believe in enlightenment? So said yes, 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 yes. So that was interesting. This was very clear, and it was in a way. So I think one of the clues is indeed in this question of cultural hegemony. And here I think indeed the scholars and the intellectuals have a role to play and to assume.
Yeah, I wanted to react. I remember when we met in Gdansk a year ago, you were speaking on the panel, and at that time it struck me, said that I'm afraid that Donald Trump is going to win. And you know, I think at that time, very many people did not believe that this can happen. Until the very last, minute, everybody thought it was a kind of joke, But suddenly we realized that you have to live with this joke, or I don't know, whatever you call it, yeah? And of course now the status quo during recent years and months is changing very rapidly. I don't know how we will manage to deal with this situation, but at least some of us, who come from Eastern Europe, we have a long experience of being, silenced, being in opposition, working in the sort of hopeless situation, and some things finally change, So I believe that we will have to learn to deal with situation unlike, we were thinking 2 or 3 years ago. But we will have to find ways how to continue, how to influence people, how to talk to people, how to help them to distinguish between lies and real things, So I have a very modest, but I still have some hope that we somehow will go through this, situation.
Well, yes, I would very much like to say something about our present day and the book fairs and so on. And that's also because I come from Gothenburg, which is, it's not Frankfurt, but it has a big book fair, not at all as Frankfurt, but the biggest one in the Nordic countries. And we had a Nazi march. And I want everybody to know that I think that all the Swedish Eurozine partners were actually in boycott, in a sense, or abstaining from taking part in this book fair this year, because we've had a conflict with the leadership of the book fair over the fact of a fake news right-wing publication that has been accepted in the book fair. So there were alternative arrangements. There was an actual Nazi march that they applied to gather outside the book fair. They had to move 100 meters. The police, so to speak, moved their marching place 100 meters, but they were demonstrating. They were aiming to demonstrate outside the book fair. So what happened was that there were several alternative arrangements where we had our talks, our public open speeches and panels on fascism and anti-fascism and a lot of things. There was also 10,000 people out in the streets. The book fair lost about 30% of their audience, and that was not because Ord&Bild was not in the room. The effect was in many ways, and I don't think it was positive. Let me say that. This was an important political thing. I don't like what happened to it. I would say that the right-wing extremists, in a sense, kidnapped it. But something had to happen here. In the end, I would say that the Nazi march lost. They didn't even get to their starting point because they decided to start to march anyway, where they didn't have, so they were boxed in by the police, etc. And in the end, they were dissolved. And this is not a conclusion, but it's an observation of these spaces and what's happening. But I would like to conclude by saying, I think we went home with some kind of happiness in our hearts that night. A lot of us, tens of thousands of people in this city did this, and it was not the Nazis that went out succeeding or winning at that point, but they managed to undermine, and this has all to do with this post-truth and fake news and epistemocracy, they managed to undermine this whole event.
Well, thank you all. Thank you for speaking, and thank you for participating. I apologize once again for not mentioning Russia nor new media, but we can continue discussing about that after.